and welcome to the Open Book channel, where I talk about everything and anything writerly, very, very honestly. My name is undisclosed, because recently I've started publishing under more than one pen name. But today, for this video, I'm Slaidey Valheim. And because I'm branching out and saying goodbye to the Valheim pen name, I thought it'd be good to talk about the most significant things I published under it, and after, I'll talk about why on earth I want to kill the pseudonym. So, as Slaidey Valheim, you may know me from having started this YouTube channel, or as a writer for my prose. I've written under this name for years now, and I can't pinpoint it, but it feels close to a decade. Back in high school, I was already writing manifestos for my vibe, and why I felt the need to separate my writing from my legal name going forward. Originally, I started as Slaidey with a Y, because that was one of my first repeated gamer tags. Then I wanted to separate my gaming from my creative content, so I switched it to an I instead. That degree of difference meant a lot to me at the time, but I know it sounds beyond silly to everyone else. My first big break in writing, I guess you could call it, was for an erotica anthology. I wrote a piece specifically for the submission call, only a couple days before the deadline, so I was surprised and thrilled that it got in, even though I'm the farthest thing from a romance writer. I spent my first years writing, submitting to anything and everything that I could that had a free submission, and I could write it in time. Aside from that outlier in erotica, I've had a couple short stories in the horror variety, accepted into charity anthologies, and a couple zines. So when it comes to fiction, Slaidey Valheim has had a mixed bag of successful publications and genres. Non-fiction, though? That's where I really took root and made my name for Valheim. I started writing on Medium during the great stay indoors years, because I worked in retail, and retail doesn't sleep, even during a pandemic. It was a lot easier to unload my thoughts into a piece of creative nonfiction than commit to writing short stories that required a certain theme or deadline. So that's what genre I leaned into for the next several years, this being roughly around 2019. I'm actually not in many publications on Medium because I mostly spread my work between Scuzzbucket and my own publication, Bits and Bones. Through Bits and Bones, my work started falling into themes that I could put into memoirs and chapbooks. In another video I talked about my writing, I went over the process of writing Home Sweet Crack Shack, and the funny ways that I approached releasing it. Written as a school project, first put on Wattpad, and then added to Amazon as an afterthought. Following the events and release of Home Sweet Crack Shack, which is a memoir, by the way, in my real life in general, I found myself really lost and upset with the way that things had played out. I had a lot of unaddressed trauma, and I used prose writing to sort through my baggage. Thus, the Bleeding Heart series was born. The Bleeding Heart series is a trilogy of prose memoirs that I published under Slaidey Valheim, which explores the fairy tale beginning and the nightmare ending of my first relationship. 3 books sounds like a lot, and it is. Not many people write trilogies about their exes. Mine was just that messy. Sometimes you've got to compartmentalize to process, and that's what I did. Each memoir explores a different aspect of my relationship and what I needed to accept to overcome the state that it left me in once it was over. I'm sure there will come a day when someone will ask me why I wrote the Bleeding Heart series. Was I looking for sympathy? Was it all just one giant breakup rant? And the answer is that I wanted to put those pieces of myself out into the world because when I run into something that I can relate to in a movie or a book, I find it very cathartic. There's something freeing about seeing what you went through, a specific scenario or trauma, when it's portrayed through another person. It helps me see what I've gone through as real and valid, and I wanted to provide that sense of release to other people who may have experienced similar situations. For example, Home Sweet Crack Shack, my first memoir, is something I wrote for a demographic that I was part of and I felt like didn't have a voice. The memoir covers my first year of university, moving out with limited resources or safety nets, and getting stuck living in a dangerous environment. That being in a bachelor apartment under a very active drug dealer who was fresh out of jail. I went from being a big-eyed straight-A student, excited to start my life with my first and only boyfriend, to being scared 24/7, distraught, and trying to smoke my days away because it was too much to cope with. This little diagram here is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, and essentially I was a young adult who'd gone from feeling like I was up here to having this ripped away from me, and I was frustrated with myself that that meant that I couldn't function well anymore. It was admittedly a very singular experience, but it also wasn't. I think a lot of us go out into the world unprepared for what it holds, and a lot of us that excelled or thought highly of ourselves throughout our school life suddenly finds ourselves lost and upset once we're met with barriers in our adult life. Not just difficulties that we didn't anticipate having to deal with, but that anyone should have to deal with. We live in a society, as they say, but society was not set up to protect me, let me tell you. So the same goes for the Bleeding Heart series, but I didn't just want to present the downfall of my relationship for that quick cathartic connection. I intended to show the entire scope of it. It would have been easy enough to refine the journals that I kept to cope with what I was going through and make a memoir out of them, and find an audience and people that went through something similar, but I wanted to create a body of work that showed the transformation. My intention was to provide readers with a bridge of understanding for those who have never been in a codependent or toxic relationship, with the ability to sympathize with those who are. Because it's hard to. Never having been in a bad relationship, it's easy to dismiss the position of those who are. I was that kind of person. I thought anyone who stayed with someone they didn't love or treated them poorly didn't deserve my understanding, because it was ultimately their decision to stay, to put themselves through that. Of course, I felt that way until I found myself in that exact situation. Even after, I denied the reality of my situation. I wasn't just telling myself that things would get better or change, I chastised myself for not being strong enough. Like my partner's treatment of me and his conditions were something I had to take on and overcome. I became the epitome of what I once thought was pathetic. And that's really, really hard to come to grips with. So, I made the Bleeding Heart series not just for people that had the same unforgiving mentality that I used to have, but to be able to, myself, process who I was and what I'd gone through. The first installment of the Bleeding Heart series feels like an outlier. Heart-Shaped Hands is a collection of romantic prose detailing the start of my relationship. There are no explicitly bad parts, necessarily. It's mostly all teenage infatuation and the belief in true love. But I wrote it and I included it along with the more upsetting installments because it's important to contextualize and understand the whole of where abusive relationships come from. And sometimes that's from a previously great relationship. That's part of how you get so gripped into staying sometimes, feeling like you're doing an injustice to how much love you were once in to give up on it. Then the Bleeding Heart series progresses into Strangling Heartstrings, where I delve into the illusions we create and the excuses that we make for the people we love. And if readers had also happened to consume Heart-Shaped Hands, it would be easier for them to understand where that kind of unreasonable devotion came from. Even when I knew I was unhappy and I wanted to leave, I was plagued with guilt at the thought of doing so, and that made it all the easier for me to be manipulated into staying. Even in Home Sweet Crack Shack, it's easy to see how me and my partner became so codependent on each other, in that we'd cut off everyone in our lives long before things between us got bad. And lastly, the Bleeding Heart series ends on the sunk heart fallacy. And that one, I know, is a stretch for anyone who hasn't been in a similar situation could possibly relate to. But I wanted to try. I had to try, for my own sake. If I couldn't find a way to sympathize with myself, then how was I ever going to move on? And again, with the progression of my previous memoirs, I hoped there would be enough connective tissue to bring readers who have never come in contact with something similar closer to understanding the mentality of someone who is bitter and trapped. So trapped that they themselves lose the ability to sympathize in order to survive the dismal state of their existence. The sunk heart fallacy is every nail in the coffin and me suffocating inside it. To clarify specifically, the sunk heart fallacy is a step more extreme than Strangling Heartstrings, which was a look at the guilt that comes with leaving a suicidal partner. TSHF explores the role of a reluctant caretaker, that I wasn't just emotionally trapped by danger a loved one posed to themselves, I was physically trapped, driven to a state of depression by being pinned to sustaining said person's life. It begs the question, at what point can you forgive yourself and not call yourself selfish for choosing your own life over someone else's, because they've driven you to the point where you'd rather you both just died? In these memoirs, I am not a perfect person. I share excerpts of thoughts that I had at the time, and I am not kind, and some of it's pretty desperate and messed up. But that's just how it was. That was the reality of it. That's what it feels like. What all that emotional damage does to you. As for my partner, I am equally not trying to paint him as a villain or anything. My intent was to showcase codependence and emotional abuse for what it really looks like, how it really happens. And in doing so, I helped myself see my relationship for what it was and finally forgive and move on. Because it happens slowly and sneakily and it morphs over time. Your boundaries and what you can handle keep getting pushed. And if other people can see that in me, maybe they could see that in themselves too. Learn to understand themselves like I had to learn to understand myself, but in their case, through my experiences. I know in saying all that, it sounds like I expect my readers to get a lot from those memoirs, and maybe someone will. I hope that someone will, but I know they're not perfect. They can never be perfect because they were too raw to refine, and if I tried any more than I already had, the essence and ability for catharsis would have been lost. At least for me, the writer, the person I was actually writing them for. The problem with the Bleeding Heart series is that I absolutely hated writing it. It was horrible. Every time I sat down to write or edit the later installments of Strangling Heartstrings or The Sunk Heart Fallacy, I'd succumb to the mental state I was writing about. I was straight up forcing myself to relive my trauma, and it was torturous. But that's the thing about going through something so difficult. I didn't feel like I could move on by just ignoring it either. Being happy in the shadow of what I'd been through didn't feel like it was an option. So, as much as it pained me to revisit my past experiences, I felt like I needed to offload them mentally somewhere else if I ever wanted to not feel haunted by them. It took years, but finally I did it. I published the Bleeding Heart series, and in seeing it physically outside of myself, I was, in a new kind of way, able to validate my experiences and heal. But I would like to stress that the process was just the worst. I felt guilty I had so much baggage and that it was holding me back from happiness in my life now. But, you know, trauma takes its time to process, and that's what I did. So overall, with the Bleeding Heart series written and published under Slaidey Valheim, the pseudonym feels like it belongs to it. Yes, I wrote a lot of other stuff under Valheim, but my memoirs are the most prominent. They're what I fixated on and obsessed over for years. As much as being Slaidey Valheim has been rewarding in its ways, it's also been devastating. The Bleeding Heart series held me back from the joy of writing other things that I wanted to. There was no love of the craft so much as a primal need for human exploration. It's what defines my pen name now, and will always be under this pen name. But it's not the kind of writer that I want to be. It's just the writer that I'd had to be. And now, I don't. I don't have to be that person anymore, and I'm thinking maybe it would be easiest for me to leave Slaidey Valheim behind, with her magnum opus creation, the Bleeding Heart series, and move on, actually and completely, into another writer persona, the new me. So I think this is the end of the chapter of my life that was Slaidey Valheim. It feels strange. That's who I am, and who I have been for so long, but it's true. I don't feel attached to it anymore, the way that I had been, and Valheim drags behind it a past that I don't want to carry forward with me. I'm not sure who I'll be now, but I'll be happy to introduce you to me as soon as I'm ready. So please stick around. I'd like to meet you. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me or this channel, you can find a link to my Ko-fi in the description below. A very special thanks to all of the open book supporters. You are the best, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.